Welcome to this course that is being used as a part of the Health and Safety program at your workplace. I'm Gary Morgan, and I'll be your presenter today. Your health and safety is of utmost importance to your employer. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, requires employers to provide a safe workplace and train employees on the safe work practices specific to their workplace. If you have any questions about the information provided in this presentation or questions regarding safety issues specific to your workplace, ask your employer's safety coordinator to address them. There are many components of a health and safety program. The topics that will be covered in this course are hazard communication, emergency action planning, safety on walking and working surfaces, ladder and stair safety, use of personal protective equipment, confined spaces and controls, equipment and machine guarding, ergonomics and musculoskeletal disorders, and lockout-tagout. Any other hazards specific to your job tasks will be covered separately by your employer. OSHA requires your employer to assess the hazards in the workplace. They can include being struck by or caught between objects, slipping or tripping on walking and working surfaces, electrical hazards, exposure to dangerous atmosphere, chemical hazards, emergency situations, falls, and confined spaces, just to name a few. After the hazards are identified, then your employer must take appropriate action to protect workers from the hazards. This slide shows some of the written programs that can be in place to protect workers. Once hazards are identified, then your employer must take appropriate steps to eliminate or minimize the hazards. The first step is to consider administrative controls, such as substitution of a hazardous chemical with a non-hazardous or less hazardous chemical. If the administrative controls don't eliminate or minimize the hazards, then the employer must consider engineering controls. Engineering controls may include better ventilation, enclosing the hazards, and machine guards. If the administrative and engineering controls don't eliminate or minimize the hazard, then personal protective equipment will be provided. Your employer will issue the PPE to you, training you on its use and care, and enforce its use. Now let's look at some of the specific written safety programs. Hazard communication is about chemical hygiene. If there are hazardous chemicals in your workplace, then your employer will have a written hazard communication plan. The hazard communication plan includes your employer's methods of communicating the hazards of chemicals used in the workplace. This will be through providing access to the safety data sheets and labeling on the materials used in the workplace to show hazard warnings. Your employer will review with you the labeling system being used in your workplace. Here are the titles of the required 16 sections of an SDS. Identification, hazard identification, composition or information on the ingredients, first aid measures, firefighting measures, accidental release measures, handling and storage, exposure control and personal protection, physical and chemical properties, stability and reactivity, toxicological information, ecological information, disposal considerations, transport information, regulatory information, and other information. Section 1 is for product and company identification and can include supplier details, including the name, address, phone number, etc., product identifier, other means of identification, recommended use of the chemical and restrictions, and emergency phone numbers. Section 2 is for hazards identification, classification of the chemical, signal words, hazard statements, symbols, and precautionary statements, description of any hazards not otherwise classified that have been identified during the classification process. Section 3 is for substances composition and information on ingredients. It shows the chemical name, the common name or synonyms, the CAS or chemical abstract service number, and the percentage concentration of each ingredient. Section 4 is for first aid and is a description of necessary measures to be taken in case of contact with the chemical. This section is subdivided according to the different routes of exposure, such as inhalation, skin and eye contact, and ingestion. Section 5 is for firefighting measures. It will include suitable and unsuitable extinguishing media, specific hazards arising from the chemical, special protective equipment, and precautions for firefighters. Section 6 is for accidental release measures and includes personal precautions, protective equipment, and emergency procedures to be used in case of a spill. It can show the methods and materials for containment and cleanup. Section 7 is for handling and storage and provides precautions for safe handling. Section 8 is for exposure controls and personal protection. Since your employer attempts to eliminate or minimize hazards prior to the use of personal protective equipment, you may find that even though this equipment is shown on the SDS, it may not be required in your workplace. Employers will use this information to determine the correct type of PPE to provide when it is required or requested by an employee. Section 9 is for physical and chemical properties, which includes the appearance or the actual physical state of the chemical, including color, odor, pH, the melting point or freezing point, initial boiling point and boiling range, flash point, evaporation rate, the upper and lower flammability or explosive limits, the vapor pressure, relative density, solubility. Also the auto-ignition temperature, decomposition temperature, and viscosity. Section 10 is for stability and reactivity, so it indicates reactivity, chemical stability, the possibility of hazardous reactions, conditions to avoid such as static discharge, shock, or vibration, incompatible materials, hazardous decomposition products, and storage. Section 11 describes the various toxicological or health effects and the available data used to identify those effects, including information on the likely routes of exposure, which can be inhalation, ingestion, skin and eye contact, symptoms related to the physical, chemical, and toxicological characteristics, delayed and immediate effects, and also chronic effects from short and long-term exposure. Whether the hazardous chemical is listed in the National Toxicology Program Report on carcinogens or has been found to be a potential carcinogen in the International Agency for Research on Cancer monographs, or by OSHA. Section 12 is ecological information. It includes information on the chemical's effect on the environment. Section 13 is for disposal considerations. It is a description of waste residues and information on their safe handling and methods of disposal, including the disposal of any contaminated packaging. This would apply to the corrosives and flammables that may be used in your facility. Section 14 is on transport information. It can include how the chemical can be transported, such as by air, land, or sea. Section 15 is regulatory information. It covers both domestic and global safety, health, and environmental regulations specific to the product. Section 16 contains other information and includes the date of preparation of the SDS or the last change to it. In most cases, containers received from manufacturers and/or suppliers are labeled with the name of the product and hazard warnings. Whenever additional labeling is needed, such as when a product is removed from the original container and placed into a secondary container, then the new container must be labeled. Let's look at this label to better understand the information that can be placed on the product. The first part shows the product identifier, which is found in Section 1 of the SDS. The product identifier is the recognized chemical name and code used to identify a chemical. The product code is also found in Section 1 of the SDS. The product code is a set of numbers used by various associations to help identify chemicals in a database format. The signal word on this label is warning. The signal word can be either warning or danger. This label also contains hazard statements and precautionary statements. The additional information is the name of the manufacturer or could be the distributor and that company's address. Also note the pictograms on the right side of the label. In the following slides, we will discuss the various pictograms that you'll be seeing on the products and sometimes on the safety data sheets. These are the pictograms that you may already be seeing in some of your products, but will become more visible as manufacturers begin changing their labels to conform to the globally harmonized system. Let's look at each symbol and what they can mean to you regarding the hazards associated with the chemicals you use. This pictogram will indicate health hazards. This one, flammable materials. The exclamation point indicates that the chemical may be an irritant. This symbol portrays a corrosive. This one, an explosive substance. A compressed gas cylinder. This is one when it's under pressure. The dead tree and the dead fish will determine that it is dangerous to the environment. This one will indicate that it will be an oxidizer. And the final one would be the skull and crossbones, which indicate that this is a toxic substance. Over the years, many companies have relied on the National Fire Protection Association and the Hazardous Material Identification System to set voluntary standards for hazardous chemical labeling. The NFPA system and the HMIS system use a number rating system of 0 to 4 to indicate the severity of the hazard. The hazards are health, fire, and reactivity. The lower the number, such as 0, the less severe the hazard. This chart indicates these types of hazards and the numbering system. Here are some of the hazardous chemicals that can be found in a plastics mold manufacturing facility, for instance. Note that compressed gas cylinders are considered a chemical. Let's review some safe practices necessary to protect workers who are handling and storing compressed gas cylinders. Leave valve protection caps in place until cylinders are secured and connected for use. Never tamper with or alter cylinders, valves, or safety relief devices. Do not subject cylinders to low temperatures or temperatures above 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not place cylinders where they can become part of an electric circuit. Use brackets, chains, or straps around the upper third of the cylinder to secure cylinders in storage or in use. Maintain a minimum of 20 feet between oxidizers and flammable gases and other combustible materials, such as oil or grease. Firewalls, such as a partition 5 feet high with a half-hour fire rating, can be substituted. Store flammables in well-ventilated areas away from oxidizers, open flames, sparks, and other sources of heat or ignition. Avoid dragging or sliding cylinders. Do not lift cylinders by the caps. Compressed gases should be handled only by experienced and properly instructed workers. The user should first identify the product within the cylinder from the label or stencil on the cylinder before use. If the cylinder is not labeled to show the product contained, then the cylinder should be returned to the supplier unused. Ensure there is no oil or grease on hands or gloves, cylinders, valves, regulators, gauges, and fittings. Oil and oxygen can combine with explosive violence if ignited. This is an example of a hazard during the withdrawal of oxygen. You must follow the written procedures that your employer has established. This is definitely an example of an unsafe situation. OSHA requires employers to assess the types of emergency situations that may occur in the workplace and take steps to address them, either in a written program or verbally to workers. It's better to be prepared for an emergency situation than to have time wasted figuring out what to do when the emergency is happening. Your employer will review with you the emergency action plan in place at your workplace. But let's look at some situations that can pertain to emergency preparedness. Some of the actions that are usually covered in an emergency action plan include evacuation procedures, procedures in the event of a fire, also procedures to address personal injury, spills and leaks, severe weather conditions, workplace violence. The plan should include the location and use of emergency equipment and should also provide for training of workers on these procedures. Fire safety is important in your facility. Fire extinguishers should be available in the event of a fire. Fire extinguishers should be inspected by a designated individual monthly and by an outside company annually to ensure they are in good working order. Individuals who may be expected to use an extinguisher in the facility must be trained on its proper use. All other employees who are not trained to use the extinguishers should evacuate the facility and instructed to meet at a designated gathering place. Ensure that extinguishers appropriate for the class or type of fire are provided in the facility. The class rating is indicated on the fire extinguisher. Your employer will inform you if you are authorized to use a fire extinguisher. Here are the steps to activate an extinguisher. Pull the safety pin located in the handle. Aim at the base of the fire. Squeeze the handle and then sweep the fire back and forth. Also remember that once a fire extinguisher is used, it needs to be recharged, so always inform the person responsible for maintaining the fire extinguishers if the fire extinguisher has been used. Your employer will inform you of the location of the outside assembly area in the event of an evacuation. The inside assembly area when shelter in place is indicated. Always gather in the designated assembly areas so that a personnel count can be taken. Your employer will also need to account for any visitors. Should further evacuation be needed, you will be informed at the gathering place. Only re-enter a building when an authorized person has indicated it is safe to return. Pay attention to the possible fire hazards that may exist in the facility and take necessary precautions. They can include ensuring the proper storage of flammable liquids, not allowing flammable items such as plastic dust to accumulate in an area. Inspect portable heating devices and don't take them into the work environment unless authorized by the employer. Don't overload electrical circuits. Handle and store compressed gases properly. Don't store corrosives with solvents as they can have an adverse reaction with each other. Only use designated smoking areas. The last thing your employer wants is for you to get hurt on the job. Some of the personal injuries may include eye injuries. Always wear safety eye protection when it's required. If you have an eye injury and the SDS indicates to rinse your eyes, use the closest eye wash to your work area. For a cut or minor skin injury, then use the items provided in the first aid kit. If your employer requires reporting of first aid injuries, then ensure you report this type of injury. Always refer to the SDS for proper first aid or treatment for injuries from chemicals. If you receive a skin burn, then use proper first aid, which could include running cool water over the burn. Of course, refer to the SDS for correct treatment. If you inhale dust or fumes and are concerned about an injury from that type of exposure, then refer to the SDS and follow the employer's safety controls. Your employer may have on hand an AED or employees trained in CPR. Follow the employer's instructions if an AED is available. Chemical spills can be extremely dangerous. If a spill kit is located in your workplace, your employer will inform you of the location. Let's review the steps that should be taken in the event of a chemical spill. Step 1. Notify personnel in the area of the spill. Evacuate if necessary. Alert the facility's emergency responder if a spill is out of control. Step 2. Refer to the SDS for instructions on spill confining, containing, and cleanup. Wear appropriate PPE for cleanup of the hazard. Step 3. Place all materials in an appropriate container, and then properly dispose of spilled chemicals and cleanup materials. Workplace violence. Workplace violence is defined as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. The best ways to prevent workplace violence are: if you see something, say something. Don't just ignore a situation that causes you concern. Control access to the building. No tailgating. In other words, if you have provided a device for entering or exiting the building, then don't loan that device to anyone else. And don't allow someone to enter the building behind you or tailgate with your entrance. Be aware of your surroundings. Report to your employer any unusual behavior of someone inside or outside of your workplace. For instance, if you see someone parked outside day after day and you are concerned about their intentions or authorization to be on the premises, report it to your employer. Take threats seriously. Report a situation where you have been threatened so your employer can take the appropriate action to provide a secure workplace. Walking and working surfaces. There are many conditions that can cause a slip, trip, or fall, So let's look at some of these. This condition of cables across a walkway and work surface can create a slip, trip, or fall situation. It appears that the gate is intended to block entrance to this area. However, workers entering that area are subject to a tripping situation that could result in a fall. This slide shows some examples of slip, trip, and fall hazards. One is a slippery surface, another an unguarded hole, an electrical cord across a walkway, and material that appears to be pellets that could create a slippery surface. All of these should be either marked as a potential hazard to bring attention to the risk or eliminated to prevent the hazard. If you see these types of hazards, you should report them to your supervisor for correction. Ladders, scaffolds, and scissor lifts have their own fall prevention requirements. Regardless of height, if a worker can fall into or onto dangerous machines or equipment, employers must provide guardrails and tow boards. Ladders can be very dangerous if used incorrectly. Personnel should inspect the ladder for damage before use. Inspect the ladder rungs for oil, grease, or mud. Make sure the ladder shoes are clear of debris, and always face the ladder when ascending or descending. If a ladder is used, always use the right ladder for the job. Ensure it is tall enough to reach the work area without standing on the top rung. Do not carry items or tools up the ladder with you. Always maintain 3 points of contact when ascending or descending the ladder. Always fully open the ladder before use. If an extension ladder is used, place the feet of the ladder on a firm, level surface. Utilize the 4-to-1 ratio. For every 4 feet of ladder length measured from where the ladder contacts the support point, the base of the ladder should be 1 foot away from the supporting structure. The ladder must extend 3 feet above the landing. Place ladders on stable and level ground and secure the base of the ladder. Fixed ladder safety. A fixed ladder is one that is permanently attached to a structure, building, or equipment. It is normally equipped with cages or other ladder safety devices. Fixed ladders over 24 feet must be equipped with a personal fall arrest system. Personal protective equipment may be required in your job. Your employer will ensure that you are trained on how this PPE must be worn, cared for, and disposed of. For eye protection, it's important that your employer choose the correct type of eyewear to protect you from the type of hazard. Eye protection must meet recognized safety standards. ANSI is one of the agencies that tests safety eyewear and provides a rating, such as Z87.1, which means that the safety eyewear is impact resistant. Safety eyewear is much stronger and more resistant to impact and heat than regular glasses. They are also usually equipped with side shields that give you protection from hazards that may not be directly in front of you. Goggles may provide you more protection than safety glasses because they fit closer to your face. Because goggles surround the eye area, they give you more protection in situations where you might encounter splashing liquids, fumes, vapors, powders, dusts, and mists. Prescription and non-prescription safety glasses are available. However, there is also an OTG that can be used to cover prescription eyewear. Face shields offer you full face protection and are often used around operations that expose you to molten metal, chemical splashes, or flying particles. When you are not wearing your eye protection, it should be protected from damage by placing it in a container. Gloves are also a type of skin protection. Reusable gloves should be rinsed after chemical handling and allowed to dry. Your employer will provide you the correct type of glove to protect workers from exposures. Some types are shown here. Employers must assess if there are any areas in the workplace that require the use of respirators. If there are, then a written respiratory protection program will be followed. This can include fit testing of workers who are required to wear respirators and completion of a medical questionnaire to determine if it is safe for the worker to wear a respirator. When the employer determines that respirators are not required, then they will inform you of any areas where hazardous dust and fumes exist and the types of administrative and engineering controls that are in place for your protection. If you still want to request a respirator, then according to Appendix D of the Respiratory Protection Program, you will be provided a respirator. If noise has been identified as a hazard in the workplace, then hearing protection will be provided. This can range from simple ear plugs to ear muffs. Your employer will notify you of areas where hearing protection is required and show you how to use these items. If your job requires the use of protective clothing, your employer will discuss this requirement with you. There could be jobs where you are required to wear a long sleeve shirt or long pants for protection. Also, aprons, gowns, or coveralls may be required. Follow your employer's requirements for the use of protective clothing. Foot protection may also be a requirement. The employer may require steel toes to protect against falling objects, fiberglass toes to protect from electrical hazards. The boot or shoe may need to provide good traction to protect against slips and falls. Protective boots must meet ANSI Z41-1991 to provide impact and compression protection. Work shoes should be comfortable and fit well. Pants should be pulled over boots for extra protection. As you can see here, this worker realizes that there's definitely a hazard to his eyes and face, but I don't think this bucket is ANSI approved. Do you? Your employer must identify if there are any spaces in your workplace that are considered confined spaces. A space must contain all three of these characteristics to be considered a confined space. It must be large enough area for an employee to enter and work. It has limited means of entering and exiting. And it is not designed for continuous occupancy. A permit-required confined space must contain all three of the previously listed confined space characteristics: a large enough area for an employee to enter and work, limited means of entering and exiting, and it is not designed for continuous occupancy, plus one or more of these additional hazards. The space contains or has potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. It contains materials that could engulf an entrant. The space has an internal configuration that might cause an employee to be trapped. Or it contains any other safety or health hazards. Here are some confined space hazards and examples of controls to protect workers. The hazard is moving parts of equipment, structural hazards, entanglement, slips, falls, or uncontrolled energy. The controls could be instituting lockout-tagout of electrical, steam, water, or hydraulic energies, and the use of personal protective equipment. The hazard is engulfment and temperature extremes. Controls include removing engulfment material and using fans or heaters to control the temperature. The hazard is noise or poor visibility. The controls could be using PPE or using explosion-proof lights. And finally, a hazard with a toxic atmosphere, flammable, explosive, oxygen-enriched, or deficient. The controls would be to perform atmospheric testing and continuous monitoring and ventilation. If your employer has identified confined spaces in their facility, then they have classified the confined spaces as either a permit-required confined space, a reclassified confined space, or an alternate entry procedure confined space. The confined spaces would then have posted signs at the entrances of the confined spaces to warn employees of the hazard. If entry to a permit-required confined space is required, then the employer must have implemented a written permit-required confined space program and developed entry procedures. If the permit-required confined space will not be entered, the entrances to the confined spaces will be secured to prevent unauthorized access. You will be trained on confined spaces and the associated hazards. Machinery and equipment must be inspected and maintained as recommended by the manufacturer and must not be used with defective parts which may create a hazard. No modification of equipment is allowed that is not consistent with the manufacturer's specifications. OSHA's machine guarding requirements include one or more types of guards to protect from hazards, guards affixed to the machine when possible, guard the point of operation if it exposes employees to injury. Revolving barrels, drums, containers must be guarded by interlocked enclosures. It cannot turn without a guard in place. Exposure to fan blades. You must then guard openings over 1/2 inch. Equipment and machinery hazards include being crushed by moving equipment or parts, drawn into moving equipment, struck by moving parts, or struck by failed components or particles. Proper guarding should prevent contact between hazardous moving parts and the body or clothing of a worker. It must be secure and not easily removed. It must protect from objects falling into the machinery, and it should create no new hazards, including sharp or rough edges. And it should create no interference with the job being performed, the comfort of the employee, or the speed of the machine. It should also allow for safe lubrication without removing the guards, if possible. There are many ways that employers can install guarding methods on equipment. Some of them include keeping the worker a safe distance from the hazard, installing guards and other devices, optimizing safe feeding and ejection methods, using robots, and other miscellaneous types of aids to protect workers. Let's look at some types of guards. Fixed guards. This is a barrier that is a permanent part of the machine, and it is preferable over other types of guards. An interlocked guard stops motion when the guard is opened or removed. A self-adjusting guard adjusts according to the size or position of the material. And an adjustable guard is a barrier that may be adjusted for different applications. Examples of types of devices include a pullback device, where cables are attached to the operator's hands or wrists. It removes the hands from point of operation during a danger period. A restraint device. Cables are attached to a fixed point and wrists or hands. It is adjustable to let the hands travel in a predetermined area. Safety tip controls. Stops the machine when tripped. Other types of devices include two-hand control. Concurrent use of both hands is required, preventing the operator from entering the danger area. Photoelectric, radio frequency, and electromechanical presence sensing device. A machine cycle will not start or stop immediately if the device is triggered. Interlocked gates. The machine will not cycle while the gate is opened. Contact with unguarded machinery can result in amputation or even death. It is important to perform inspections of equipment prior to each use and implement a preventive maintenance program for equipment. Check for equipment defects and check all guards before each use to assure they are providing the appropriate protection. Never remove or bypass a guard. The belt behind this man's head must be guarded to prevent contact. Look at how close this man's head is to the belt should it begin running. It wouldn't be a pretty sight. Your employer must assess any work-related factors that pose a risk of musculoskeletal disorders and eliminate or minimize the hazard through ergonomic controls. Ergonomics is the science of fitting workplace conditions and job demands to the capabilities of the worker. The purpose is to reduce stress and eliminate injuries and disorders by designing tasks, workspaces, tools, lighting, and equipment to fit a worker's physical capabilities and limitations. Some of the major risk factors for back injuries are heavy physical work, lifting and forceful movements, bending and twisting, whole body vibration, and static work postures. Some ways to prevent back injuries are: take breaks and stretch before and during work. Ask for help when lifting heavy objects. Use mechanical lifting devices when possible. Bend the knees, keep the back straight, and the load close to the body when lifting. This standard covers the servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment in which the unexpected energization or startup of the machines or equipment or release of stored energy could harm employees. This standard establishes minimum performance requirements for the control of such hazardous energy. This slide shows various types of energy that may need to be locked out or tagged out. Potential energy is contained in any object that is at rest. It is also called stored energy. The energy in all moving objects is known as kinetic energy. Flammable energy is converted from the combustion of gases, liquids, solid chemicals, and vapors. Chemical energy is the capacity of a substance to do work or produce heat through a change in its composition. Chemical energy can be converted from gases, liquids, solid chemicals, and vapors. Electrical energy is a form of energy resulting from the flow of electric charge. Thermal energy is also known as heat energy. Thermal energy is the energy that comes from the temperature of a material or object. Pneumatic and hydraulic energy is the energy stored in pressurized liquids or air. Radiation energy is energy related to ionizing, low-frequency electromagnetic, optical, or radio frequency electromagnetic radiation. And mechanical energy is the energy stored in a system by reason of the position of its parts. Repairing and/or maintaining equipment during normal production operations are covered by lockout-tagout if an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or other safety device, or an employee is required to place any part of his or her body into an area on a machine or piece of equipment where work is actually performed upon the material being processed. This is at point of operation. Or when an associated danger zone exists during a machine operating cycle. Let's look at the different levels of employee involvement in lockout-tagout operations. The person who services or performs maintenance on machines and equipment is considered the authorized employee. An affected employee is the person who operates or uses a machine or piece of equipment which is being serviced. All other employees are personnel who work in an area where lockout procedures are being used. If you are an employee who must perform lockout-tagout as a part of your job, then you will receive specific training on the lockout-tagout program in your workplace. If you are an affected employee or person who works in an area where lockout procedures are being used, then your job is to leave lockout-tagout up to the authorized employee and not attempt to remove any locks or tags. In summary, your employer will inform you of hazards specific to your workplace and your job. The controls that are in place to protect workers will be explained to you. If you have any questions regarding the safety programs in place at your facility, or have concerns regarding your own safety while at work, please contact your employer or their designated safety officer. This course is a part of your employer's health and safety training program. You must follow all safety practices. You must report work-related injuries and illnesses to the designated person in your workplace so that an investigation can take place to prevent recurrence. Thank you for viewing this online training course. Please contact SafeLink Consulting if you need further assistance. We address your business needs, whether they are a basic safety program to meet OSHA compliance or a comprehensive health and safety program for effectively managing worker safety. SafeLink also provides assistance with FDA compliance and quality systems. Please visit our website or contact us to learn more about other services we offer.